The rhythmic tap of a pen against a leather-bound agenda was the only sound in the sterile, beige-walled meeting room of the Oak Ridge Estates Community Center. It was a precise, metronomic beat, a countdown to someone's quiet humiliation. Roy Henderson watched from his plastic chair in the back row, his turn on the Architectural Control Committee's agenda, still 2 items away. He had come to this meeting expecting a simple, procedural rubber stamp for the fence he'd already had permitted by the city. What he was witnessing felt less like a neighborhood committee meeting and more like a court-martial. At the head of the long folding table sat Karen Miller, president of the Homeowners Association and chair of the ACC. Her blonde hair was arranged in a helmet of immaculate engineering, and her blazer was the sharp, unforgiving white of a fresh snowfall. Her smile, when she used it, never quite reached her eyes, which held the flat, placid look of a winter lake. Her attention was fixed on Mr. Gable, an elderly widower who clutched a crumpled photograph of his late wife, Eleanor, the subject of the hearing, a set of small, melodic wind chimes hanging from the eaves of his front porch. "Mr. Gable," Karen began, her voice a polished, condescending balm. "We've reviewed your submission. While the committee appreciates the sentimental value you've attached to the items in question, the fact remains that Section 9.1.5 of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions is quite clear. No device which produces audible sound that may be heard from an adjacent property shall be installed without prior written approval from the ACC." "But Eleanor loved them," Mr. Gable whispered, his voice thin and reedy. "She said they sounded like angels." "They're not loud. Karen, you can barely hear them from the sidewalk." Karen's smile tightened by a millimeter. "The standard is not loudness, but audibility. Your neighbor, who wishes to remain anonymous, has filed a formal complaint. The sound carries. Mr. Gable, it constitutes a nuisance." She tapped her pen on the violation notice in front of her. "The committee's decision is to uphold the violation. You have 14 days to remove the chimes. A fine of $50 will be assessed on day 15, doubling every 30 days thereafter. Thank you for your cooperation." She didn't look at him as she said it. Her gaze had already shifted to the next name on her agenda. Mr. Gable stood, his shoulders slumped in defeat, the photograph of his smiling wife trembling in his hand. He shuffled out of the room without another word. Roy felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This wasn't about rules. It was about the cold, procedural breaking of a man's spirit over a set of wind chimes. It was a demonstration of power, as clean and merciless as a surgeon's scalpel. "Next," Karen announced, her eyes scanning the room and landing on Roy. "Mr. Roy Henderson, Lot 42, regarding the unapproved fence structure." Roy felt the eyes of the other committee members, 2 men who seemed to take their cues directly from Karen, and a nervous-looking man named Arthur, who studied his hands turned to him. The cold knot in his stomach tightened. His simple, procedural rubber stamp was about to be fed into a wood chipper. Life for Roy and Susan Henderson was supposed to be about sanding down the rough edges. At 62, Roy had stepped back from the relentless grind of running a full-scale contracting business. For 3 decades, he had built half the custom homes in this very subdivision, transforming acres of farmland and dreams into Oak Ridge estates. He knew the building codes by heart, the load-bearing capacity of every standard beam, the precise concrete mixture needed for a foundation that would outlast its owners. He was a man who believed in blueprints, in rules, in the quiet satisfaction of a thing built correctly. Now, he took on smaller jobs, deck repairs, kitchen remodels, work that kept his hands busy and his mind sharp without stealing his weekends. Susan, his wife of 38 years, was his perfect complement, a meticulous bookkeeper for a handful of small local businesses. She saw the world in spreadsheets and balanced accounts. Where Roy built the physical structures of their life, Susan managed the foundations of their security. Their shared goal for this chapter was tranquility. They wanted quiet mornings with coffee on the back porch, long walks, and the freedom to enjoy the nest they had so carefully built. Their peaceful retirement plan acquired a new, four-legged variable 2 months ago, a beagle mix from the county shelter named Cooper. Cooper was a 50-pound bundle of anxiety and affection with a nose for trouble and a talent for escape that Houdini would have envied. He could find the one loose picket in 100 feet of fencing, or dig his way under a gate with the quiet determination of a POW. He needs a perimeter, Roy had declared after the third time he'd found Cooper happily trotting down the common area sidewalk, trailing his leash behind him. The solution was a fence, not a fortress, but a simple, handsome barrier. 4 feet of vertical cedar planking, clean-lined and unassuming, set a full 2 feet inside their property line on all sides. Roy, being Roy, did it by the book. He'd pulled the city permit himself, presented his plans, and received the official stamp of approval. He hired a professional crew to set the posts, ensuring every measurement was exact. The result was a perfect, modest enclosure that gave Cooper a safe place to chase squirrels and offered the Hendersons peace of mind. Standing on his back deck, coffee mug in hand, Roy admired the finished product. The warm scent of fresh-cut cedar filled the crisp October air. The fence didn't loom or dominate. It simply defined their space. A quiet statement of home. Susan joined him, wrapping an arm around his waist. "It looks wonderful, Roy," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Proper. Safe." "Built to last," he replied, feeling a familiar surge of pride. In his world, that was the highest compliment. Cooper, oblivious to the architectural significance of his new playground, was already testing its integrity, sniffing along the baseboard for any hint of weakness. He found none. For the first time in weeks, Roy and Susan could let him out into the yard and simply relax. The fence was more than wood and nails. It was an investment in serenity. It was the final, finishing touch on the quiet life they had earned. They were blissfully unaware that in the world of homeowners associations, a declaration of private peace can sometimes be interpreted as an act of public aggression. The first shot in the war was fired not with a bang, but with the dry, crinkling sound of a certified mail envelope. It arrived on a Tuesday, October 15th. The mail carrier, a cheerful woman named Brenda, handed the green and white slip to Roy with an apologetic smile. "Looks official," she'd said. Inside their quiet kitchen, Susan sliced apples while Roy tore open the stiff paper. His contractor's eyes, trained to spot flaws in blueprints and building codes, scanned the single sheet of paper within. His brow furrowed. "What is it?" Susan asked, pausing with the knife in midair. He held it out for her. The letterhead was crisp. Professional Oak Ridge Estates, Homeowners Association, CO Property Management Solutions, Inc. Below, in bold, unforgiving type, were the words, "Formal Notice of Violation." Date, October 15th, 2023. Property lot, 42, 112. Arbor Lane, Henderson. Roy and Susan cited. CCNR. Section Paragraph 8.4.2. Nuisances and unsightly conditions. Description of violation: installation of an unapproved fence structure on the private lot, which obstructs a designated neighborhood view corridor and creates an unsightly condition visible from the common area street. Required action: complete removal of the offending structure. Compliance deadline: November 14th, 2023. 30 days from date of notice. Failure to comply by the deadline will result in the levying of fines. Beginning at $100 and doubling every 30 days, The violation remains unresolved. Roy read it again, the words blurring into a fog of bureaucratic nonsense. Designated neighborhood view corridor, he said aloud, the phrase tasting foreign and absurd in his mouth. There's no such thing. It's not on the plat maps. It's not in the CC&Rs. I've read them. Susan took the letter, her bookkeeper's mind immediately calculating the financial threat. Doubling every 30 days, Roy. That's exponential. It's a mistake, Roy said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and disbelief. It has to be. I got the city permit. The fence is 2 feet inside my property line. It doesn't obstruct anything but a view of my own lawn. He thought back to the ACC meeting, to the cold, procedural dismantling of Mr. Gable over a handful of wind chimes. This wasn't a mistake. This was a method. I'll go to the next hearing, he said, the resolve hardening in his voice. I'll bring the permit, the survey, the CC&Rs. I'll show them the facts. Logic has to count for something. Susan placed a hand on his arm, her expression clouded with a worry that went beyond the letter. Just be careful. Roy, you saw what she did to Mr. Gable. This isn't about logic. But Roy was a builder. He believed in solid foundations, in measurable truths. A rule was a rule. A fact was a fact. He was certain that once he laid out his evidence, this ridiculous misunderstanding would be cleared up. He neatly folded the violation notice and placed it in a new manila folder. On the tab, he wrote in clean, block letters, fence. He had no idea how thick that folder was about to become. The community center meeting room felt colder than it had 2 weeks prior. Roy sat at the long table opposite Karen and the ACC, his folder laid out before him with the precision of a legal exhibit. He had his documents arranged in a logical sequence, the official city permit for the fence, stamped and signed, the certified property survey, clearly marking his lot lines and the fence's interior position, and a printed copy of the Oak Ridge Estates CC&Rs, with every mention of fence, structure, and nuisance highlighted. When his turn came, he stood and presented his case with the calm, methodical clarity he used when explaining a complex building plan to a client. Good evening, he began, addressing the committee but looking directly at Karen. I'm here to appeal the violation notice regarding the fence at my property. First, I'd like to submit the official permit from the city, which approved the fence's design, materials, and location. He slid a copy across the table. Second, here is the certified survey of my lot. As you can see, the fence is constructed a full 24 inches inside my private property line, and therefore does not encroach on any common area. Another copy slid across the table. Finally, he said, tapping the bound copy of the CC&Rs, the violation cites an obstruction of a designated neighborhood view corridor. I have searched this document, the plat maps, and all associated bylaws. The term view corridor is not defined, nor is one designated anywhere in the governing documents for this community. The violation, therefore, has no basis in the written rules we all agreed to. He sat down, confident that the sheer, unassailable weight of his evidence would carry the day. He had presented facts, not emotion. He had followed the procedure. He had proven his case. Karen picked up his documents, glancing at them for a fraction of a second before setting them aside. She folded her hands, her expression one of polite patience, as if listening to a child's fanciful story. Thank you for your perspective, Mr. Henderson, she said, her voice smooth as polished marble. The committee appreciates your thoroughness. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. However, the authority of the Architectural Control Committee is not limited to explicitly defined terms. Section 8.4.2 grants the committee discretion to determine what constitutes a nuisance or unsightly condition. The committee has interpreted that a solid 6-foot fence, it was 4 feet. A detail she conveniently ignored so close to the common area sidewalk creates a visual barrier that is inconsistent with the open, harmonious aesthetic of the community. It is, in our judgment, an unsightly condition. Roy stared at her, his mind struggling to process the deliberate distortion of reality. But it's not unsightly. It's a standard cedar fence. And my neighbors on either side have told me they think it looks great. The opinions of individual neighbors are not the purview of this committee, Karen said, her tone unwavering. We are charged with upholding a consistent standard for the entire community. The committee's interpretation of Section 8.4.2 stands. Arthur, the nervous board member, shifted in his seat and opened his mouth as if to speak. But a quick, cold glance from Karen silenced him. He looked down at his hands again. Therefore, Karen concluded, picking up her gavel with a sense of finality, the appeal is denied. The violation is upheld. The 30-day compliance window remains in effect. The notice of fine will be sent accordingly if the structure is not removed. Next on the agenda. Roy sat frozen in his chair. It was a sham, a complete kangaroo court. His evidence, his permits, his logic, none of it mattered. He had come armed with a blueprint, and she had countered with a sledgehammer of subjective interpretation. The first fine, for $100, would be levied in 2 weeks. He gathered his papers, the crisp documents now feeling flimsy and useless. As he walked out of the cold, beige room, he knew with chilling certainty that this was never about a fence. He just didn't know what it was about yet. But he was a man who solved problems for a living. And Karen Miller had just become his most complicated project. The day after the hearing, Roy's workshop became his war room, the scent of sawdust and machine oil, usually a comfort, now felt like the smell of industry, of preparation. He cleared a large space on his workbench, laying out the violation notice, his rejected evidence, and a fresh legal pad. This was no longer a simple dispute. It was an investigation. His first move was procedural. He drafted a formal, polite email to Property Management Solutions, Inc., citing the section of the state's property code that grants homeowners the right to inspect an association's records. He requested digital copies of the last 12 months of HOA Board of Directors meeting minutes, the association's current budget, and all contracts executed in the past year. He knew they had to comply by law, but he suspected the fight would be in the details. He was right. A week later, he received a password-protected PDF file. The budget and contracts seemed innocuous enough: landscaping, pool maintenance, insurance. But the meeting minutes were a masterpiece of obfuscation. Entire pages were redacted, with thick black bars covering motions, vote tallies, and, most suspiciously, all discussions under the heading New Business. The official reason, noted at the bottom of the page, was redacted to protect attorney-client privilege and matters pertaining to executive session. It was a smokescreen, and he knew it. Meanwhile, Karen's campaign of attrition intensified. A second violation notice arrived, this time via regular mail. It was for improperly stored refuse container, citing Rule 7.c of the Community Guidelines, which stated that trash and recycling bins must be removed from the curb and stored out of public view by 6 p.m. on collection day. The notice included a time-stamped photo, taken from a car, of his bins still at the end of his driveway. The time on the photo was 6:12 p.m. The fine was $25. It was so petty, so transparently vindictive, that Roy could only shake his head. This was designed to needle him, to wear him down with 1,000 tiny cuts. He tried talking to his neighbors, hoping to find allies. Most were sympathetic, but fearful. "She's got eyes everywhere." "Roy," one neighbor whispered to him over the back of the very fence in question, "you fight her. She'll find something. Your lawn is half an inch too high. You have a crack in your driveway. She'll get you." His only real confidant was Mike, the retired history professor who lived 2 doors down. Mike, a man who had studied the rise and fall of empires, saw the current conflict in a much broader context. They'd sit in Mike's meticulously kept garden, sipping iced tea. "This is classic authoritarian tactics, Roy," Mike said, "pruning a rosebush. Isolate the dissenter, overwhelm them with bureaucratic minutiae, make the cost of fighting higher than the cost of compliance. She's not trying to win an argument. She's trying to exhaust you into surrender." Roy felt that exhaustion creeping in. The first $100 fine for the fence had been posted to his HOA account. The property management company had sent a follow-up letter, noting the fine would double to $200 on December 15th if the violation remains uncured. The paper trail was growing, a stack of polite, menacing letters documenting his non-compliance. In his workshop, he tacked the CC&Rs to a large corkboard with a red marker. He circled the clause she kept using, Rugger 8.4.2 nuisances and unsightly conditions. It was vague, subjective, and powerful. It was the perfect weapon. He started a timeline on his legal pad, documenting every letter, every conversation, every fine. He was a builder, and he was laying a new kind of foundation, a foundation of facts. He was certain there was a flaw in Karen's design, a weak point in her structure. He just had to find it before the whole thing came crashing down on him and Susan. The breakthrough came on a cold, drizzly evening in early November. A quiet knock on the front door. So soft, Roy almost missed it. Made him look up from the stack of redacted minutes he was studying for the 10th time. Through the peephole, he saw the hunched figure of Arthur Pinter, the perpetually nervous ACC board member. Roy opened the door. Arthur stood on the porch, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, clutching a plain manila envelope to his chest, as if it were a life preserver. He wouldn't meet Roy's eyes. "Mr. Henderson," he stammered, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Roy's shoulder. I can't be part of this anymore. It's not right." He shoved the envelope into Roy's hands. "I was never here." Before Roy could say a word, Arthur turned and scurried back into the rain-swept darkness, his car starting with a nervous cough and quickly disappearing down the street. Roy closed the door, his heart beginning a dull, heavy beat behind his ribs. He carried the envelope into the kitchen where Susan was paying bills. He slid it open with a kitchen knife. Inside was a single sheaf of papers, stapled in the corner. It was a copy of the August Board of Directors meeting minutes. But these were different. These had no black bars. Together, he and Susan read the section that had been completely redacted in his official copy. Motion made by K. Miller to approve expenditure of $15,000 from the Capital Reserve Fund for a common area topographical and utility survey on Common Area Parcel C. A. Pinter questions the necessity of such a costly survey on undeveloped land. K. Miller states it is for future community enhancement planning. Vote 3-2 in favor. Yay Miller. Thompson, Lee, nay Pinter. Davis. Motion to award the survey contract to Precision Geoanalytics, LLC. Vote 3-2 in favor. Parcel C, Roy murmured, walking over to the large plat map he had pinned to the wall in his study. He ran his finger along the lines. Parcel C was the 6-acre tract of undeveloped woods and meadow owned by the HOA, the common area directly adjacent to his property. His new fence ran along a 100-foot stretch of its border. Susan was already on her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Got it," she said a moment later, Precision Geoanalytics LLC. Registered with the state 2 months ago. She clicked another link. And its registered agent is Thomas Davidson. The name hit Roy like a physical blow. Tom Davidson was a well-known, aggressive local developer. Roy had seen him having coffee with Karen at a cafe downtown just a few weeks ago, their heads bent close together over a set of rolled-up plans. It all clicked into place with the force of a tectonic shift. The fence wasn't the issue. The fence was an obstacle. It was a 4-foot-high, cedar-planked complication for whatever Davidson was planning for Parcel C. The vague view corridor and unsightly condition violations weren't about aesthetics. They were pretexts to get the fence torn down, to clear the way for a survey, and then for whatever came next. The $15,000 survey, approved in a secret vote and paid to a company owned by the developer himself, was the proof. This wasn't just a power trip. This was a conspiracy. Roy looked at the unredacted minutes, then at the map, then at Susan. The fight had just changed. It was no longer a defensive battle over his right to a fence. It was now an offensive campaign to expose a secret deal that was being funded by his own HOA dues. He now understood what Karen was protecting, and, more importantly, he knew she had broken the rules, the real rules to do it. Karen must have felt the shift in the battle lines, because her retaliation was swift and brutal. She stopped attacking him through the HOA's flimsy rulebook and began a direct assault on his livelihood. The first blow landed via certified mail, a thick, intimidating envelope from the State Contractor Licensing Board. Notice of formal investigation. It read, an anonymous party had filed a formal complaint citing multiple citizen concerns about his business practices, alleging unsafe job sites and shoddy workmanship. An audit of his last 5 years of projects was now mandatory. Roy, who had maintained a spotless license for 35 years, felt a wave of nausea. An audit was a bureaucratic nightmare, a swamp of paperwork and legal fees that could take months to navigate, even if he was ultimately cleared. The second blow came 2 days later. A phone call from his business liability insurance agent. Roy, I don't know what's going on. His agent, a man he'd known for years, said apologetically, but we've been flagged by our underwriters. They received an anonymous tip about undisclosed risks associated with your policyholder address. Something about hazardous materials and structural instability. We have to schedule a full risk assessment of your property and your workshop. Karen was trying to bury him. She couldn't win on the facts of the fence, so she was attacking his reputation and his finances, forcing him to spend his time and money defending his entire professional life. The financial bleed was immediate. Roy had to retain an attorney to handle the licensing board inquiry, an upfront cost of $3,000. The insurance assessment would likely lead to higher premiums, regardless of the outcome. It was Susan who bore the brunt of the emotional and social toll. She saw the cold stares at the community mailbox. A neighbor she'd been friendly with for years abruptly crossed the street to avoid her at the grocery store. The whispers followed her like a shadow. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the growing pile of legal bills. Her usual composure had crumbled, replaced by a raw, brittle fear. Roy, look at this, she said, her voice trembling as she pushed a bank statement across the table. Our savings. We're burning through them. For what? For a principle. For a piece of wood. He started to speak, to tell her about the secret deal, the corruption. I don't care about Parcel C. She cut him off, tears welling in her eyes. I care about us. I care about our home. She's not just fighting you anymore. She's trying to ruin us. People are treating me like a pariah. Is this worth it? Is this fence worth our retirement? Please, she begged, her voice cracking. Just take it down. Let's just make it stop. Her plea was a gut punch. He saw the true cost of his fight reflected in her exhausted, frightened face. This was the moment of choice, the fulcrum on which everything balanced. Give in, and they might find a fractured piece. Press on, and he risked losing everything he and Susan had built together. A few days later, seeking a moment of quiet, Roy drove into town for groceries. As he walked down the canned goods aisle, he heard a familiar voice, low and sharp. From the next aisle over, it was Karen, her back to him, her voice a venomous whisper into her phone. "I told you, the payment is coming at the end of the month," she hissed. "You can't file the judgment. I need more time. No, you listen to me. You'll get your money when I get it." The tone was not of a powerful HOA president, but of someone desperate, cornered, a collection agency. Roy realized the desperation didn't excuse her actions, but for the first time, it explained them. The finder's fee from the developer wasn't just a bonus, it was a lifeline. He wasn't just fighting her pride, he was fighting her survival. And a desperate person was the most dangerous kind of opponent. He put his basket down and walked out of the store. His decision made. He couldn't back down now. He wasn't just fighting for a fence anymore. He was fighting for every homeowner she saw as an obstacle to her own salvation. The Oak Ridge Estates annual homeowners meeting was Karen Miller's coronation. It was her stage, her yearly address to her subjects, where she would outline her triumphs in property value preservation and community harmony. The community center was packed, the air thick with a mixture of civic duty and morbid curiosity. The fence dispute had become the neighborhood's biggest drama. At the front of the room, Karen sat at the center of the board's table, a portrait of calm, executive authority. Behind her, a large projection screen displayed the meeting agenda. In the bottom right corner of the screen, a small digital timer was set to 5:00. This was for the open forum, a strictly enforced 5-minute slot where residents could air their grievances. Karen wielded that timer like a guillotine, cutting people off mid-sentence with a polite, "Your time is up. Thank you for your comments." Roy had signed up. When Karen called his name, a smug, indulgent smile played on her lips. "Mr. Roy Henderson, Lot 42. You have 5 minutes." Roy walked to the podium, not with a stack of papers, but with a small remote for the projector in his hand. He had called the management company earlier, posing as a board member, and gotten the password to the presentation laptop. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, some hostile, some curious, some friendly, like Mike, who gave him a subtle, encouraging nod. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and even. He clicked the remote. The agenda on the screen was replaced by his first slide. The timer began its countdown from 5:00. "This is the official plat map for my property. Lot 42 on file with the county," he said, pointing to the crisp, clear image, as you can all see. "My fence, indicated here in red, is located entirely on my private property. It does not touch, cross, or impede upon any common area." He clicked again. A new slide appeared, a side-by-side comparison. On the left was a page from the redacted meeting minutes he had received from the HOA. On the right was the same page, unredacted. "These are the August board meeting minutes. The version on the left is what I was provided. The version on the right is the truth." He used a laser pointer to circle the secret vote, a 3-2 vote to spend $15,000 of our money on a topographical survey. A survey paid to a company called Precision Geoanalytics. A low murmur rippled through the audience. Click. The next slide showed the incorporation documents for Precision Geoanalytics LLC. listing Thomas Davidson as the registered agent. Next to it was a photo of Karen and Davidson at the coffee shop, deep in conversation. Click. The fourth slide was the key. It was a document his consultant, a sharp retired title clerk named Sarah, had unearthed from the dusty archives of the county recorder's office. It was an easement deed application, filed by Davidson's development company 2 weeks ago. This is an application to grant a utility easement across Common Area Parcel C, the land right behind my house. Mr. Davidson needs this easement for his proposed Oak Ridge Villas development. Without it, his entire project is landlocked and worthless. The murmurs grew louder. People were sitting up, leaning forward. Karen's face had become a pale, frozen mask. Click. The final, devastating slide. It was a screenshot of an email. Karen. It read, confirming our agreement. Finder's fee of $50,000 to be paid to you personally upon successful granting of the Parcel C easement by the board. Let's get that fence issue handled ASAP so the surveyors can get in. Tom. 045. 044. This was never about a view corridor, Roy said, his voice ringing with quiet authority. It was never about an unsightly condition. It was about a $50,000 secret commission. This is a direct violation of Section 12.1 of our CC&Rs, which demands the board exercise its fiduciary duty to act in the interest of all homeowners, not for personal financial gain. The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the soft ticking of the timer on the screen. And one last thing, Roy said, turning to his neighbors. I know this fight has made good people nervous. I know my friend Mike over there worries that his prize-winning roses are technically 6 inches too close to his property line. This kind of selective enforcement has to stop. He took a breath. My first suggestion to the next board is that we pass a good neighbor resolution, granting amnesty for all minor, good faith aesthetic violations under a certain threshold. We should be building a community, not a collection of fines. He set the remote down on the podium. The timer on the screen blinked to 000. Dead silence hung in the room for a beat, thick and heavy. Then, the dam of stunned silence broke. In the deafening silence that followed Roy's presentation, it was Mike who found his voice first. The retired history professor, who had watched empires rise and fall in textbooks, now stood to witness the collapse of a petty tyrant in a community center. He rose slowly to his feet, his voice clear and steady. I make a motion, he declared, his words cutting through the tension, for the immediate suspension of the president, Karen Miller, from all board and committee duties, pending a full, independent financial audit of this association's records. Second, the word came not from one voice, but from a dozen. A chorus of pent-up frustration finally released. All eyes turned to the head table. Karen sat motionless, her face ashen. The color drained away as if her life's blood were pooling at her feet. The 2 board members who had been her loyal lieutenants looked from her to the angry faces in the crowd, their expressions a mixture of panic and dawning betrayal. It was Carol, the professional manager from Property Management Solutions, Inc., who moved to save her own skin. She stood, smoothing her blazer, her face a carefully composed mask of professional concern. She saw the lawsuits taking shape in the air, the massive legal exposure for her company. Given the serious nature of the evidence presented, she announced, her voice a model of corporate detachment, the management company strongly recommends the board proceed with a vote on this motion. We will, of course, cooperate fully with any independent audit commissioned by the association. In that single statement, she had severed her company's ties to Karen, leaving her isolated and exposed. The acting vice president, a man who had spent years in Karen's shadow, hesitantly called for the vote. A forest of hands shot into the air. The motion passed with a roar of aye that shook the beige-walled room. Procedurally and publicly, Karen Miller was dismantled. She was no longer president, no longer chair, no longer in command. She was just a homeowner, stripped of her power, left to sit alone at the table as the community she had ruled with an iron fist began the work of reclaiming itself. Roy didn't feel triumph, only a profound sense of weary relief. He had brought the flaw in the foundation to light, and now the structure was collapsing under its own corrupt weight. The independent audit was as swift as it was damning. It confirmed every point Roy had presented, and more. The auditors uncovered a clear pattern of manipulation, proving Karen had intentionally misled the board about the purpose of the survey and had actively worked to sell off a valuable community asset for her own personal enrichment. The new board, elected in a special meeting a week later, acted decisively. They voted unanimously to permanently remove Karen from her position, on the advice of new legal counsel. They initiated a civil suit against her to recover the misused $15,000 survey fee and other damages related to her breach of fiduciary duty. All violation notices and fines against the Hendersons were formally voided and expunged from the record, with a written apology sent from the board. At the first meeting of the new board, the newly elected president turned to Roy. "Roy, you showed us how broken our rules are, or at least how easily they can be twisted. We'd like you to chair a special committee to rewrite the vague ACC guidelines, especially Section 8.4.2, to ensure this can never happen again." Roy, a man who believed in building things correctly, accepted. But the audit had one final surprise. As the forensic accountants dug deeper into years of financial records, they uncovered a secondary, more mundane pattern of deceit. For years, Karen had been running a small-scale embezzlement scheme, skimming a few $100s off landscaping contracts, over-ordering and then returning supplies for cash refunds she pocketed, and billing the HOA for administrative expenses that were, in fact, her personal bills. The total came to just over $25,000. It was the final, pathetic piece of the puzzle, revealing a woman whose grand corruption was built on a foundation of petty theft. Months later, at a well-attended community meeting, Roy's committee presented their proposed changes: clear, objective rules with a fair and transparent appeals process. The Good Neighbor resolution passed unanimously. Then, Roy took the podium one last time. The board, through its legal action, has successfully recovered $25,000 that was improperly spent by the prior administration. He announced, "This money was born from a conflict that started over one man's fence, built to keep his rescue dog safe." He looked out at his neighbors, no longer a collection of fearful individuals, but a united community. "I move that we use these funds to build a community dog park on Common Area Parcel C, turning the very land that was the source of so much division into a place that brings us all together." The motion was seconded, and the vote was met with a spontaneous round of applause. That evening, Roy and Susan walked home, Cooper trotting happily between them. They paused at their fence, the cedar having weathered to a soft, silvery gray. It stood straight and true, a quiet monument not to a fight won, but to a peace restored. Roy looked past it, toward the undeveloped parcel where children and dogs would soon be playing, and felt the deep, satisfying calm of a project finally, and correctly, completed.